Hey, what's up everybody? This is Erin from Erin's Audio Corner. Today I'm going to be reviewing the Linkwitz LXmini. The designer, Siegfried Linkwitz, which for some reason I have the hardest time saying, is no longer with us, unfortunately. He's a genius. He was a great person. I emailed him a few times and he was always very responsive. Even when I asked like the dumbest questions, he was always nice enough to take his time and to answer them. Has a great website, which I'll link in the description below. You can go and find it. Was always very forthcoming and did his best to educate and inform the public about speaker design. And this is one of his babies. This comes in kit form, and I actually ordered it from Madisound. Well, I didn't order it. I've got to say that the folks at Madisound were great. They actually sent the kit to me free of charge for the review. I actually had reached out to them and asked if they would be willing to, help me out with dealer price to save me a little bit of money because I was going to pay for them out of pocket. And they just said, we got you, and sent it to me. Now the kit comes with the 4 drivers, which is a 6-inch mid-woofer, a 4-inch full range. So 2 pair of those. It comes with a PVC end cap, a couple other miscellaneous hardware pieces that you'll need for the kit. And then I also got the portion of the kit that includes the CNC machined wood pieces to make my life a little bit easier. And then on top of that, it comes with the Mini DSP 2x4 HD, which is kind of the workhorse behind this design. With that, you are actively processing these speakers. So you're going to need 4 channels of amplification, 2 for each speaker. The Mini DSP has the crossover network and the equalization networks built into it. And once you purchase the kit, you'll get plans. And with the plans, there will be a website where you can go and download the configuration file to set all this stuff up and get it running. Now, my channel is mostly focused on the objective side of things, but I always listen to speakers because, man, I love this stuff, right? I just love it. And I listen to speakers before I start my review process or the measurement process because I want to hear the speakers. I want to kind of get an untainted, as best I can, inclination of what the speakers are doing. And then I can pair that up with what the data shows and see, how that matches up. And to me, that's where the science of things comes into play is, how what you hear correlates to the data. So in my initial listening, which was done in my living room because I couldn't set this up in my home theater, in my living room, I don't know the exact dimensions, but let's just say it's a large open floor plan living room. I pulled the speakers about 3 feet out from the wall, had everything set up, sat on my couch, which surprisingly put the full range driver at ear level. I didn't expect that. They looked short. I think 40 inches about the total height, but it worked out in the end. Full range drivers, the problem with the majority of them is that once they start to beam, once they become non-pistonic, once the pressure on the cone is different at different points, they start to behave differently off axis quite wildly from how they are on axis. Now, ideally, as you traverse off axis to the side of the drive unit, you just lose SPL higher in frequency. But most of the time, what happens is you not only lose SPL, but the radiation pattern of the speaker is just changing drastically. You may have a dip on axis at a certain frequency and then go off axis at 30 degrees and have a peak of 6 dB, or vice versa, or anywhere in between under the sun. It's crazy. But these drive units do a very good job of controlling their dispersion in terms of linearity on and off axis, which means that once I set the speakers up, I pulled out the HD or the Mini DSP settings and I made a few adjustments and I was in business and I was really happy. That aside, let's talk about the mid-woofer. Now, it's a single 6-inch mid-woofer in a 4-inch PVC tube. Pick it up to show you. This is what it is. Look, there's the bottom of it. Now, it's coupled with a 4-inch PVC pipe coupler, and it's actually attached, it's pulled on this hose clamp. And then the top portion of it, where you see the mid-range mounted with the enclosure to it, it's put in place via silicone. The other thing to note is how the full range driver is attached. So if you look up here, you can see I've got some screws going through the PVC pipe, that is the enclosure portion. And then it's kind of going through and you can see some wood blocks in here, and those wood blocks are attached to the motor the magnet of the driver. That means that the driver's frame is not directly attached to the overall assembly of the speaker, which should theoretically lower any kind of structure-borne resonance that would transmit through the basket, through the frame, and into the rest of the speaker. So I think it does that pretty well. I don't mean there's no way for me to guarantee it, but it seems like it's doing the job. The other thing also is that, yeah, check it out. It's not sealed on the back. So if I pull this stuffing out, it's wide open on the back. That's pretty cool. And I think that gives it some of its pizzazz in the soundstage. And that's what we're going to talk about next, the soundstage. So for me, personally speaking, tonality, as long as the speaker can be equalized, tonality is not a big thing. I can go in and fix that, shape it via EQ if I need to. Soundstage, that's something that you can't fix with EQ. Once the design is done, once the crossovers are set in place and the drivers are chosen, you can't go in and you can't equalize the radiation pattern to be wider or more narrow. I mean, within reason. I know there are some DSP tricks that you can do some all-pass filters and stuff like that on the crossover network, but then we're talking about adjusting the crossover. I'm talking about just pure parametric EQ or graphic EQ. You can't use those things to change the radiation pattern of the speaker. With that said, there's a lot of speakers that, while they have a great soundstage, they don't do a lot of things that I like. And you can't fix that with EQ. So if I don't like that about that speaker, I'm not going to buy it. For instance, most box speakers tend to have very rectangular soundstage areas, right? Like you could basically look bird's eye view down on top of the speaker, draw a box around it, say, here's the edges left and right for width. Here's the front boundary for depth. Here's the rear boundary for depth. And if you have a good speaker, it's going to layer well between that. Now, KEF to me kind of is like the next step up. Their stereo width isn't as wide as I want it to be, or I should say their radiation width isn't as wide as I would personally like it to be. I wish it was like 20 degrees wider, maybe just a little bit wider, but their depth and their layering is superb and I love it. Now this speaker kind of goes the next step where it takes that rectangular shape of a soundstage and it kind of pushes it out. But instead of being well defined, you don't know exactly where the edges are. So it's like, you know that something's over here, but you don't know exactly where it stops. And to me, that's a cool thing. To some of you, the way I'm describing it, you may think that's negative based on your own experience, and that's fine. But for me personally, that's a really cool thing because I like some ambiguity to the soundstage. I don't like to know that there is a hard boundary right here. The soundstage does not extend beyond this, no matter what source material I'm listening to. No matter how wide the stereo image is supposed to be based on the source material, because remember, it all really comes down to the source material. No matter how wide it's supposed to be, it's going to stop right there. Well, with these speakers, it's not a hard stop. It's like, hey, it's kind of out there and it just kind of goes into space. It's such a weird audiophile way to say it, but frankly, I don't know any other way to describe that. The other thing that I really like about these is that not only do they kind of just go out into the ether, right? But they have really not precise, super precise imaging, but they have good imaging within the soundstage. Now, let me take an extreme example. The Bose 901 Series 5 that I tested about 2 years ago was an awesome speaker in terms of soundstage. It was one of the worst speakers in terms of accuracy because its frequency response was all over the place. But in terms of soundstage, it was awesome because it was just huge soundstage. It used one direct firing driver on the front, 5-inch full range, and then 8 on the rear of the speaker. And those 8 fired into the back wall, into the front wall, I guess, if you're looking toward the front. And then it's radiated and reflected all that sound off of it. And that's what gave it such a huge, enormous soundstage. But everything was really like, where's stuff at? So when the singer was supposed to be dead center, you're like, well, the singer's here. Oh, now the singer's there. Now the singer's down there. Like, it was all over the place. And that was the drawback. And the other side of that would be, you know, like a wave-guided horn type design where it's very well controlled dispersion, not very wide, but very precise pinpoint imaging. So those are kind of two extremes. This speaker is kind of in between. And I think it's kind of a good spot in between where it's not too ambiguous, but at the same time, it's not super well defined to the point where you feel like you're saying, here's the edge of the soundstage and here's the exact location of the instrument. Now, these are all personal things. I'm just letting you know that this kind of is leaning more toward what I would like. whereas you may like something different. But I think it's really cool. And to me, that's the real one selling feature of this particular speaker. If you plop them down in your room and maybe you're like me at first, you're like, man, this tonality to me is like, yeah, it could use some work. You've got the EQ. Just make a few little things in your EQ, adjust a couple things, enjoy it, because you're going to get the soundstage that you're not going to get from pretty much, I would say like 95% of other speakers just don't do what this speaker does in terms of soundstage. I also do want to mention that the bass on this speaker, you're going to want a subwoofer. It does extend down into about 50 hertz or so in room, but it's not with a lot of gusto. So when you have a kick drum music that I like, yeah, it's going to be a little bit weak in that area. It'll do it, but it's just not going to do it with the oomph. So if you want more from 50 hertz and below, you are going to want a subwoofer, but I think you probably already understand that given what you're looking at. And I will say that the bass is pretty nice. I would say that the overall tonal signature of the speaker is maybe more toward the warm side with the occasional glare or grit that comes out. And again, that's some areas that I just applied some equalization to finesse. And overall, yeah, I like the speaker. Don't take my word for it though. Make sure you do your research before you commit to it, because it is a project. It probably would take you a solid day if you're pretty comfortable with tools and building things. It might take you a couple days or more if you are not. So just, allot some proper time. And yeah, now let's switch over. We'll show you a quick build montage and then we'll talk about the data. We start off with a blank table and then the process begins. Opening up all the drivers, Madisound, huge shout out to Madisound. Mini DSP, and then these are the CNC cut pieces that I was provided. This is me cutting the PVC that I bought from the store. And now I am just starting to assemble and put everything together. And every once in a while, you'll see my German Shepherd. Her name is Ray. She'll come into the frame and try to play around with me and see what I'm doing. Hey, this is another day. Look, I even changed shirts. I probably didn't take a shower, but I changed shirts. So I've assembled the feet here. I've assembled pretty much all the parts for one, and I'm just kind of putting things together now. Assembling the first one fully, it looks like. Some foam, and here we go. So that was it. Cool. All right, first things first, we are going to start with the CEA 2034 dataset, which I capture using my clip-on near-field scanner. It is a state-of-the-art robotic measurement device that allows you to get anechoic data in a non-anechoic environment such as my garage, which you see in this video. Now, the reason for this is to characterize the overall performance of the speaker before it even enters the room. And this is great information to have. And it actually allows me to go a little bit further and use equalization, use this data to help me define where the best place to equalize a response is. First of all, we have the OnAxis response, which is in black, and we can see that here. The listening window, which is plus or minus 30 degrees to the side of the speaker and plus or minus 10 degrees above and below the speaker, is provided here in the dashed green. The sound power is in the dashed red, and the early reflections is in the dashed blue. And what we're looking for here is for each of these curves to all kind of follow each other pretty well. I mentioned earlier that most full range drivers don't behave good off axis, and that the things they do off axis are different than the things that they do on axis. And that means that you can't equalize that particular driver. Well, what we see here is that all of these responses match pretty well in amplitude. And that means that we can equalize the response, which is further evidenced by the early reflections directivity index down here. Now, ideally, this is a linear slope, or maybe it's just a flat line. Where in amplitude this is defines how narrow the radiation or how forward projecting the speaker would be, but we're not going to get into that right now. What we're looking for here really is just a kind of, what's the general trend of this speaker? And the general trend of the directivity index is that it does follow a linear fashion, with a few exceptions, like right around 800 hertz. And then we've got some other high frequency aberrations here that could be from the drive unit itself, or it could be to the cone filtering of the structure. So the drive unit, the radiation bouncing off the cone of the woofer below it. There could be a number of things going on here. But really what I'm seeing here is a speaker that takes reasonably well to equalization, and that's great. So a few highlights we're going to hit here. I've highlighted this particular area in the high frequency where you can see the nonlinearity begins, and it's about 2 kilohertz or so and above. We see that start to take over. However, the good directivity index means the ability to EQ to taste. I also wanted to note that the F3 and the F10 of this speaker relative to the mean is 50 hertz and 33 hertz respectively. So this speaker does have the ability to get down relatively low in a room. And for, I would say, most pop music, maybe like rock music and stuff, you're going to be okay with it. But if you have anything that gets below 50 hertz or you really want the grunt of a good kick drum, you're going to need to either DSP the speaker and just listen at lower volumes or add a subwoofer. This is the same speaker, but what I've done is I've added some equalization to the Mini DSP. The Mini DSP has 10 slots of equalization per channel. So there's 4 channels on the Mini DSP's output. I think 5 or so of them are taken up with EQ curves for the speaker for the low frequency and the high frequency. I don't remember exactly the number, but I was left with enough that were empty that I could go in and kind of tweak some things. So what I did here was I put a shelf filter around 550 hertz and bumped this up a little bit to kind of flatten it out, which we can see if we kind of compare here. And I'll go back again. You can see how I've kind of raised this up a little bit. Now, what I should have done also is maybe taken a parametric EQ with a Q of maybe like 1 or 0.5 or so, drop this down maybe a half a dB and kind of level that out a little bit more. That would have got me more linear right through this particular region. And then I'll also added some EQ bands up in the higher frequencies around 4 kilohertz, 2 kilohertz. And I adjusted the ones that came stock with the speaker at around 10 kilohertz and around 16 kilohertz, I believe. What you can see is that this response kind of trends down a little bit. So I probably went a little bit heavy-handed in these cuts. I maybe should have done, instead of like 2 or 3 dB, I should have maybe just done 1 or 2 dB. But you can kind of see just how well this speaker takes to equalization. And again, the directivity index doesn't change. The reason for that is because you can't change the directivity. You can't change the radiation pattern of the speaker when it's already baked with EQ. So you can't say, I want the speaker to sound wider. I'm going to do something in the EQ to make it sound wider. There are little frequencies here and there that you can change. For example, a lot of people will cut 5 kilohertz to give you a sense of depth in the soundstage, but that's kind of just like parlor tricks and psychoacoustic things. You're not really truly changing the radiation pattern of the speaker. You're just attenuating the SPL, or you're bringing it up a little bit. So we can see that, again, while I did add EQ, I didn't change the directivity index at all. And that's expected. This is the estimated in-room response of the default system. And that's where we can see this little bump right through here that I played around with equalizing. And then we have some other things going on in this area. Now, the 10 kilohertz bump from like 8 to 10 and then back down, this stood out to me in my listening. And then this 4 kilohertz area also stood out to me in my listening. And that's really why I wanted to target those in my own equalization. If you draw a trend line through here, you can kind of see what the response is doing. So when I bump this up, it's essentially the same thing as bringing this down. It just kind of depends on how you look at it. When I added my own EQ though, this is what I got. The red is the original and the black is the new. Now the black is too sloped and high frequency. I would go in and change that. I would probably kick up another, maybe a high shelf filter somewhere around here and flatten it out a little bit, but not flat, but just make it not so steep in the fall off. This is the horizontal radiation pattern. And if I draw some lines through here, we can see that the radiation is wide in the lower frequencies to about 1.3 kilohertz. And then it starts to narrow up, and above about 2.5 kilohertz or so, that's where the 4-inch full range driver is starting to beam, and it's starting to narrow up in radiation. And there's really not much you can do about that at all unless you maybe do some mechanical hacks. Maybe put some kind of diffuser pad on top of the drive unit itself and make the effective radiating area a little bit smaller. There's some really neat stuff that JBL does with some of their diffusion, and you might want to check that out if you just Google JBL diffusion and see what you can find. That's some pretty neat stuff they've got going on out there. Another thing I want to note too is there's some additional energy sent to the back of the speaker, which, remember, that 4-inch full range driver, the enclosure is wide open on the back. So, well, roughly wide open. So it's going to send more energy out into the room, and it gets you a more like a dipole type pattern. And that's kind of what we're seeing here. We're seeing less energy off to the sides and more energy to the front and to the back. This is the harmonic distortion at 86 dB. And I've drawn a couple notes here. 40 dB down is 1% THD. 30 dB down is 3%. And then if we go to 96 dB, we see basically the same trends here, except just rising distortion. Looking back at 86 dB, I'm not really sure what's going on in this particular area, this 1.5 kilohertz distortion. It's all second order. I played around with the design a good bit. I took the speaker back off the stand. I made sure everything was tightened down really good. I made sure no cables were rattling. I made sure that the mid-range driver was attached firmly to the PVC enclosure. I also tested the second unit, and the second unit shows the same thing. So my guess, based off the impedance curve that shows a blip right around this area, is that it maybe is some kind of reflection, kind of like you have an internal enclosure reflection sometimes that creates higher distortion orders. Sometimes you'll also see where there's some kind of compliance issue between like a surround and the cone of the speaker that'll create second order distortion. I'm not saying that's it, but I'm saying that weird little oddities sometimes creep into designs, and those are reasons for having increased distortion, especially second order distortion. I don't know what's going on here. Cannot tell you for sure what's going on here, but the measurements are legitimate. I did verify them, and I even took them outside to measure off the ground just to make sure that there was nothing going on in my room, because I was so surprised to see it. But I chased it down as best I could. I don't have a for sure answer on what it is. I could take the driver out of the enclosure and test the raw driver itself, but frankly, I just didn't want to do that because at the end of the day, the results really are what they are. This is the compression or limiting test that I do. And what I'm seeing in this data lends me to think that there's some kind of limiting built in rather than pure compression, like mechanical compression from the voice coil overheating or being able to not exceed a certain amount of excursions, something along those lines. That's kind of like mechanical compression. The trends that I'm seeing here look more like electronic compression or limiting. So I verified that the Mini DSP doesn't have the limiter engaged, because it does have a compressor slash limiter built into it, and you can engage it, but with the default LXmini settings, it's bypassed, literally bypassed. So it's not engaged. I'm not sure what's going on to cause so much compression, but what we can see is that at very high output volumes, you do have reduced bass. And I believe that's what I heard. I actually felt like the speaker was more dynamic at lower volumes. And then when I got to higher volumes, that dynamicism kind of went away. And my biased judgment, seeing this data and correlating that back to what I heard, this kind of makes sense. This kind of explains to me why I didn't have that dynamic range that I did at low volumes when listening at high volume. And this is the multitone distortion test. This is the last test that I do. And this is using kind of like pink noise, and it's done to emulate actual music. So it's a whole bunch of tones at one time. And what we're looking for here is the level of distortion per output volume. The lowest volume is at 70 dB, and then it's about 78, 86, 96, somewhere around there. So this is around 96 dB output at 1 meter. Generally, what I look for is for the threshold of 3% or 2% to not be crossed. Generally, what I look for is the threshold of -30 or -20 to not be crossed, especially not above -20, because then you start to hear all sorts of garble, and it's just a really weird sound. I have a whole video on this kind of testing. I'll drop it in the card above here. Go check that out if you want to later on. I compare harmonic distortion versus IMD versus multitone distortion, and it shows you why multitone distortion is really quite useful to help you understand the actual audible limits of distortion from a speaker. And that's it for the data aspect of this review. I gotta say, I was both impressed and a little bit disappointed, if I'm being honest, and I'm probably gonna catch some flack for that, but that's just me being honest. I was hoping that the speaker would behave a little bit more linear than it did, but at the same time, I also went into this not expecting it to behave as linear as it did, if that makes any sense. You know, most full ranges, as I said multiple times before, they start to behave very non-linearly, above their beaming point. And the way that this speaker maintains its composure is good. So you can EQ it, but what I was hoping was that maybe it would be a little bit more linear out of the box with its default configuration. But this really easy to go in and tweak and change to your own, desires. And who knows, the person who voiced this, Siegfried himself, may actually like what came in the default mode. So, this is just one person's opinion on what I like, and you're free to go in and change things as you wish. The Soundstage on the speaker, though, is fantabulous. I mean, it was really awesome. I really enjoyed that kind of presentation. It's very different from a standard boxed speaker. And while box speakers do have their pros, I would say that this is certainly the pro for this particular speaker, the Soundstage. With all of that said, I do hope you appreciate it. I hope you learned something. If you have any questions, please ask, and I'll get to it when I can. I work a full-time day job, family at home, 2 dogs, kind of busy, but I try to answer questions when I can. If you like what you see and you appreciate it, please give me a thumbs up. Also, please consider subscribing and hit the notification bell if you want to be alerted to any future videos as they're released. Once again, I want to give a big thank you to the folks at Madisound, especially you, Adam. Thank you for sending all this stuff out to me for me basically to have and do whatever I want with. And I haven't decided what I'm going to do with it yet. Probably not going to keep the speakers forever. Probably will wind up giving them away to somebody who I think, kind of deserves it or could use a break in life. But I will hang on to them for a little bit longer, maybe, and try a few EQ settings. So to those of you in the LXmini community, give me a shout, shoot me an email. You can find me, I'm around, and let me know if you have any settings that you're really curious about. I can run them through the Clipple and I'll share with the community and update my results on my website at aaronsaudiocorner.com. Wow, that's a lot to say. With that said, I hope you all have a good one, and I will talk to you later. Take care. Peace.